particular acknowledgement to Peter Sims, my co-author on the book, who I met here just 3 years ago at a program similar to this. And then starting 2 years ago, we have worked together very intensely on this project, along with a third colleague, Diana Meyer, who's also with us back here in the fifth row, our fourth row. And Diana and Peter and I interviewed 125 people, leaders, and created something like 3,000 pages of transcripts. But I'm particularly pleased to be at Stanford today and have a chance to share with you some of my thoughts on leadership. And my focus today will be on leadership in the 21st century, because I'm convinced that we need new kinds of leaders in this century, and I hope you will be those new kinds of leaders. I was a kid of the Kennedy era, and many of us were very idealistic when we came out of school, and I think we kind of blew it. And I'm very disappointed in my generation of leaders, not just the crooks. There are crooks in every generation. I mean, Joe Nacio is on trial right now, and the jury's out, and how that'll come out, I can never judge a court of law because I'm not a lawyer. Even if I were, I would be smart enough not to judge it. But these are not the kind of leaders we want, and so I'm hoping you'll be that different kind of leader when you have the opportunities, hopefully earlier in your career, sooner rather than later, to be the kind of leaders we need to build great companies and great organizations in the 21st century. Because if we don't, I think we'll see a real loss in the business community. I left Medtronic, as you heard. I turned the CEO job over just actually 6 years now. Time flies. And when I was elected CEO, I said to the board of Medtronic that in those days I felt CEOs were serving too long. Today it's too short. And that I should not serve more than 10 years. I had no contract. I told them I didn't want a contract, and my commitment was that I would have a successor who was ready to go. It was Art Collins, who's done an excellent job for the last 6 years, and now he's preparing to turn things over to his successor. I stayed 1 year as chair of the board and then went off the board. But in that time, I took a working sabbatical in Switzerland and taught at a couple institutions over there, the Swiss Federal Polytechnic and IMADE, or IMD, the business school, and found I really loved teaching, and particularly loved teaching MBAs, and got great joy out of that, and also great learning. As one of my colleagues said to me, Bill, never set foot in a classroom unless you honestly want to learn from your students. And so we've adopted very much the idea that you can't teach leadership, but you can certainly learn leadership. And in a classroom here at Stanford or at Harvard, it's not about, at least in leadership, in my classroom, it's not about knowledge transfer, me transferring knowledge to you, but knowledge exchange. And that's the principle we've tried to operate on. I can say that I could not have written this book had it not been for my students at Harvard who gave me such great insights into what they were thinking and became very, very important. But why is this important? It's important because of the actions in the late 90s and all the egregious cases in this last 5 years since the fall of Enron, we have breached the trust of people in business leaders. Today, the Gallup polls show that business leaders are right near the bottom of the list in trust. Only 22% of the American people say they trust business executives. That's not just a problem. That's a formula for disaster, because when we live in a democracy, most of you who are Americans tend to think of capitalism as a right. I'm a fervent capitalism. I believe it's the world's greatest economic system, and it's had an enormous impact around the world. But we will lose those rights. It is not a right. It is a responsibility. And if we don't honor our responsibility to society, we will lose those rights. Milton Friedman was absolutely wrong. He may be a Nobel Prize-winning economist, but he is wrong when he says any business person who contributes to the betterment of society, to environmental causes, gives money from his corporate charity, or worries about affirmative action is an unadulterated socialist, which he says, and we debate in my classroom. He's just flat out wrong about that. That's not right. We have an obligation. We are chartered by society. I was on the board of a French company in the 1980s when François Mitterrand, the socialist, defeated Giscard d'Estaing for the presidency of France, and immediately they carried out their election pledge. The company was nationalized along with 12 other companies. We lost our rights. Sarbanes-Oxley is a mini version of that. If we don't get this whole thing on because people complain about Sarbanes-Oxley, but the reality of Sarbanes-Oxley is that we brought it on ourselves. And the same thing with rampant executive compensation right now. If boards of directors and compensation committees don't get control over this executive compensation, and you probably saw the editorial in the New York Times this morning, if we don't get back to a pay-for-performance system, if we continue to pay people $200 million for failing, I'll tell you, we will have legislation and we will have controls over what we do, and we won't like them and we'll complain about them, but we will have deserved it because we did not do our jobs. So how do we come out of this crisis? Well, we have to rebuild the trust. Business is all about trust. When you buy a product, or a physician implants a Medtronic defibrillator here on the Stanford campus, he or she has no idea where that product works. It's trust in the manufacturer. When you work for a company, you trust the leaders to do the right things. When you invest in a company, I always consider when people bought 1,000 shares of Medtronic stock, that was an ultimate act of trust in the leadership to give them a fair return, and I felt a heavy burden from that. But we also trust business to do the right thing by society. We have to create jobs. We have to create products of value and services of value, and any business that fails to do that will have no long-term sustainable shareholder value. If you can't create products and services that have sustainable value to your customers, you'll be out of business. So the idea that we only focus on shareholder value, short-term shareholder value, will actually, in the long run, will destroy value. And we also have to be concerned about major societal issues like healthcare, like education, like poverty, like the environment. And if we're not, I think there's a big price we'll pay. So I feel that leadership in this century must change. Why must it change? I think because the nature of people in organizations has changed. Look, I grew up, I hate to admit it, how long ago I grew up, but my father and mother lived through 2 world wars. They lived through the Depression. My father lost his job in the Depression. He paid somebody $50 to help him get a job. People just wanted a job when they came after the war. But you know, we had this idea of follow the great person over the hill, the kind of military model. And many corporate leaders operated by fear, intimidation, and we followed those leaders over the hill. Well, I can tell you, you are not going to follow that leader over the hill. Certainly not, because you should look for leaders who can empower you to lead and give you the opportunity to lead. Like Dick Kovacevich, CEO of Wells Fargo, said when he graduated from here. He said, when I came out, I didn't want to be a consultant investment banker. I just wanted to go run something. I didn't care how big it was. I just wanted to have the opportunity to go run something. You deserve those kind of opportunities, and everyone in an organization does. Today, we went through this era where we dichotomized workers and managers, and I think we created a lot of problems. That's why the automobile industry has never overcome that. That's why they're in such deep trouble, at least the American automobile industry. The Japanese and German-American automobile industry that operates in the United States is not in that kind of difficulty because they don't have that dichotomy. And then finally, in the last 20 years of the 20th century, we looked for the charismatic CEO, the person who could save the company. And this led to a lot of the difficulties. Look, if you want to be charismatic, don't go into business. You should go into the media. Be an athlete. Be a musician. Be charismatic. Be an orchestra conductor. But charisma is not what's called for in business. What's called for in business is character. Business is not about finding leaders with great style. It's about finding leaders with great substance. Nor is it about finding people with a great image. A lot of people said, can you recommend a CEO who has the right image for Wall Street? I said, no, because I don't think that's the kind of leaders you want in an organization. I think you want leaders with integrity. You want people with substance, and you want people with character. But here's why I think if you're going to be successful in this century, that companies and leaders must change. First of all, the apprentice system is virtually disappeared. You no longer learn how to do something from somebody who's been doing it for 25, 30 years. Right now, the workers know more than their bosses do about their jobs. I never had a job where I knew as much as the people working for me. And, so then you have to figure out how can you motivate people, give them the freedom, and bring them together as a team and enable them to do their very best work. Second of all, whether you're a minimum wage employee working at McDonald's or whether you're an engineer that has great opportunities, people today are looking for meaning and significance from their work. Sometimes we lose sight of that when we get too close to Wall Street. Fortunately, here we're 3,000 miles away because we start to think it's all about profits off other people's money. But people in organizations are looking for meaning and significance. And if organizations fail to give them that, they will not provide great organizations. Howard Schultz, who founded Starbucks, understands that. McDonald's went through a period where they didn't understand it. They're coming back now. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that people are not willing to stand in line for 10 to 20 years to get their opportunity to lead. Nor should they. The best time to learn to lead is right now. Look at Wendy Kopp, whom we interviewed for our book. You know, Wendy at 21 years old founded Teach for America. She had no management experience, no leadership experience. She encountered great difficulties. After 5 years, she almost had to give it up because she was $1 million or $2 million in debt and everything was declining. Yet she had that personal, internal fortitude to stay with it and make it successful. Today, 16 years later, it's enormously successful. It's one of the most successful nonprofit programs in the last 25 years. And she's learned leadership on the job, but she had a passion for making a difference in education and providing a good education for everyone. Can she change the world? Well, not all at once, but one step at a time. And I think that's the kind of thing she's doing. So I am very much an advocate for a new kind of leader. What kind of leader is that? Well, it's an authentic leader. It's a leader that is genuine and true to who they are. It's not a leader that tries to emulate someone else. Kevin Shear, who is CEO of Amgen, said he worked for Jack Welch back in the mid-'80s, and he said at GE, there was 1,000 people trying to emulate Jack Welch. He said it was bad enough working for Jack, but having to deal with 1,000 people trying to be like Jack was really impossible. But then he very thoughtfully went on to say leadership has many voices. You need to be who you are because no one can be successful trying to emulate someone else. So if somebody in your company tries to remake you into that leader they want you to become, to fit you tightly within the bounds of a big company, resist it. Because when you get too tightly bound, you'll change and you'll be different than who you are and you won't be nearly as effective. Your good qualities won't come out in the way they could. And yeah, maybe you'll modulate your negative qualities. But if you look at the great leaders, are 2 to 3 standard deviations outside the company's norms. And I think that's healthy. We need to let people be empowered to be themselves and be who they are. Well, let me talk a little bit about the study we did. We went out and interviewed 125 people. This is not an unbiased sample. We did not look at bad leaders. We picked out people that we thought were both authentic leaders and successful. And then we came back and assessed each of them on their authenticity afterwards. We did not try to make any correlation between their traits, characteristics, and styles, although many of my colleagues suggested we do that. But one reason we didn't is they didn't say much about that. In fact, some of my colleagues at Harvard said, well, can you find out what those traits are? And it did not, that's not what matters. Well, what does matter? What did we learn from the study? We studied 15 people minimum per decade from the 20s up through the 70s. 28% women, 8% American minorities, 12% international people. Quite a diverse sample of people. We want to look at the whole span of leadership across a lifetime. And we learned a great deal from our study about leadership and about how people think about leadership today. But the thing that stood out was the passion they found in their life stories. I'll never forget my call with Dick Kovacevic, CEO of Wells Fargo. I'd known Dick. We'd been on the target board for a dozen years. Knew him even before that. Probably arguably the most successful commercial banker in America for the last 20 years. And so I said, Dick, what made you such a successful leader of Wells Fargo? He said, I want to talk about what it was like to grow up in Western Washington, in a town where no one ever went to college, where the people we honored, there were no business people, so the people we looked up to were teachers and they were coaches. He said, I learned, no offense to Stanford Business School, he said, I learned more about leadership on the athletic field in the corner grocery store than I did in business school. Why? Well, he was an all-state quarterback, and every day as a kid, from age 11 till age 18, he played sports from 2:30 to 5:30, then he'd run home, grab a sandwich, and go to work for 3 hours from 6 to 9. Because he was trying to earn money to go to college. He had no money, and this is his ticket, if you will, so to speak, into college. Dick said, as a quarterback, I learned very quickly that if you had a team of 11 quarterbacks, you'd lose every single game. We had to have outstanding people at every position, and I've tried to take that into Wells Fargo, his words, and have that so that every person in my organization at higher levels is better than I am at their jobs. And that's the only reason we've been able to be successful. The head of mortgage banking, I could never do his job, and the head of consumer banking, I never could do her job, and so we've been able to build that strong team. In the corner grocery store, I try to replicate Wells Fargo much around that corner grocery store, your friendly local bank in every city in the West, every town in the West, and the Midwest as well. So you see him taking from that. Howard Schultz has a different story. He grew up in the projects, Bayview housing projects in Brooklyn, drug-infested, crime-ridden area, wasn't safe to be around. He tells the story, he came home when his father was 7, and he finds his father sitting on the couch in a body cast. He'd lost his job. He had a great job. His job was to pick up dirty diapers and deliver them to a central point. He'd slipped on the ice, broken his leg. He lost that day his job, his pension, and his health care. His mother was 7 months pregnant, couldn't go to work. They had no money, and his job as a little boy was to fend off the bill collectors. Very, very tough thing. Well, he saw his father lose 30 jobs. He thought his father was a failure. He just wanted to get away from his father, and they argued all the time. The day his father died, he rethought that, and he had a different understanding. He saw his father never had a shot. And he said, I want to create a company that my father would be proud to work at. That's why Starbucks in 1986 became the first American company to give health care benefits to all its workers, including part-time. Today, health care costs more than coffee at Starbucks. But he's going to be true to that because that's a basic principle on which he feels he's building the company. Not paying minimum wage, but trying to create a good environment between employees and customers and to create that consolation. He visits 24 Starbucks stores a week to see, does that still exist? You probably saw his letter to Jim Donald, the CEO, challenging is Starbucks, are we growing so fast that we're losing that old original coffee house? And so Howard is staying true to what he believes. It comes out of his life story. And I think that becomes very, very telling in the people we talk to. Andrea Jung, third person. Andrea is CEO of Avon Products today. She comes out of a Chinese-American immigrant family. She, very modest family, where values were everything, where discipline was everything. At 31, she was executive vice president of Neiman Marcus. At 35, she quit cold turkey. She was on her way to be CEO. She came to my classroom, and I said, why did you quit at 35? And she said, because I saw I was going to be CEO, and I didn't spend the rest of my life making luxury goods for the upper 1/10 of 1% of the American women. And so 9 months later, she went to Avon. She actually got passed over for CEO a few years later. And as one of her board members said, Andrea, follow your compass, not your clock. In other words, stay in the course of the direction you want to go. Don't worry about getting there at a particular time. Well, the new CEO didn't make it. 20 months later, he was out of a job. Andrea had been passed over, gets the job. What's the first thing she does? She changes the mission of the company from cosmetics to the empowerment of women. She said, that's the business we're in. And I had a guy in my classroom who had worked there, and I said, how's it for a guy to work at? He said, it's great. It's a wonderful environment because they have 5.5 million people today. They had 1.5 at that time. She's built up 5.5. They have 1 million in Brazil. They're now up from zero start in China to 300,000 now. But she has this great passion. She said, if I don't have passion for the work, I can't be an authentic leader. Many of the leaders we talked to went through a series of very difficult times in their life. Crucibles, as we call them. Warren Bennis picked up that term from Warren when he wrote Geeks and Geezers. And we heard some very, very moving crucible stories from people. These became the time, that transformative experience, that unique experience in their lives when they really got what leadership was all about, that it wasn't about them and getting you to follow me as the leader, but realizing it's all about we. How do we create an environment where we all have the chance to flourish? In my own life, I've gone through a series of crucibles in trying to become a leader. I'm the only child of older parents. My father felt he never realized his gifts to be a leader, and so he put that burden on me. So from age 4 or 5, I'm hearing, son, don't be like your father. You've got to be different. It's hard to be different than your father when you're an only child, but that was the mission I had. And he thought I should be, CEO of a big company. Not just CEO, but CEO of a big company. He even named the companies. He suggested, since he held Coca-Cola stock since 1937, he'd like me as CEO of Coca-Cola, or if that didn't work out, I could be CEO of Procter & Gamble, or the third company was IBM. Now, it turned out I worked in summer jobs for all these companies. It was a pretty heavy trip. And so I was resisting my father, but somehow that had been internalized in my head. And I never could figure out why I wasn't getting elected to leadership or selected for leadership roles as captain of my tennis team or other things in school. And so I ran for president of senior class. I lost 2-1. So then I went away to college 800 miles away, and stood for election 6 more times, lost all 6 times. So now I'm 0 for 7. It's pretty hard to be a leader if no one wants to follow you, right? Well, finally some seniors in my school at Georgia Tech took me inside and said, Bill, there's a reason why you're losing. You're not getting elected. It's because you have a lot of gifts, but no one wants to follow you because it's all about you. You're so busy and so ambitious, you don't have time for anyone, and no one wants to work with you. Now, that was easy to understand up here. It's very much harder to change my behavior, to change the way I interacted. But I asked people for help, and I think I genuinely learned more about leadership in those college years than just about any other time in my life. So then I went to Harvard Business School, graduated at 23. I was working in the Defense Department. And about 6 months after I got out of business school, I got a phone call, one of those phone calls you never want to hear. My father was on the line saying that my mother had died that morning of a heart attack. And I was closer to my mother than anyone else in my life. And for me, it was a real sense of devastation and feeling alone. Some of you may have had similar experiences, but it was time that caused me to really go deep into what's life all about. And we only have one short time on earth. What do we want it to be? And then I recovered and fell in love, got engaged, and I got a second phone call 3 weeks to the day before I was to be married. My fiance dropped dead of a malignant brain tumor, and I was just totally devastated. Fortunately, I had friends around me who came around and were there to support me through what were really dark times. But it caused me to go deep inside and say, what do I want out of my life? Fortunately, very fortunately, and a great blessing, I met my wife Penny just a month or so later, and we've been together ever since. And it was a very, very difficult time. And 20 years later, it took me 20 years to, the last crucible, the last I can account today, is I thought I was on route to being CEO. I thought I was going to be CEO of Honeywell. And one day, and I was on that path, and I was, it was a tough place, a little bit political. One day I was doing turnarounds, and I've always seen myself as a growth manager. And one day I was driving home, and I looked at myself in the mirror. It was a beautiful day like today. And I finally, for the first time, acknowledged I was miserable. I was totally unhappy. I was not turned on by Honeywell's businesses. I finally recognized that the company was changing me more than I was changing it, and I was becoming a different person. Why? Because I was on an ego trip to be CEO of a really big company. I went home and talked to my wife and asked her what she saw. And she said, I've been trying to tell you that for a year. You just didn't want to listen. She was right. So Medtronic had asked me to join the company 3 times over 10 years. It was a little company growing to a mid-sized company, and I turned them down just about 6 months before because I think Medtronic, in my mind, was too small for my ego. And I thought, wow, this image ideal, I'm going to be head of a really big company. Medtronic was not that. Well, when I called Medtronic back and talked to the company and thought about what it really was for this wonderful mission I learned from the founder of restoring people to full life and health, I realized this is where I should have been all along. And I'll never forget the day I walked into Medtronic. It felt like I was, for the first time, it felt like I was coming home to a place I'd never been before. You ever been in that place where you feel like, hey, I can really be myself here? This is the real me. I can be who I really am. I don't have to be something different. I can contribute here. People appreciate me for who I am. And it was just a wonderful feeling, and it was a great blessing to have that experience. So through those crucibles, I think we find our purpose in life, and that's where I should have been all along. And fortunately, Medtronic was able to grow up into a pretty good-sized company, but that wasn't what it was all about. In fact, I've always thought the thing I'm proudest of at Medtronic is that we went from restoring 300,000 people a year to new patients to full active lives to now about 8 million. And I think of all the things, it's not the market cap or the earnings or the revenues. It's really captured in that phrase. So from that, I think we learned from a lot of our leaders that your life story becomes very important because it gives you your sense of true north. And I think all of us in this room know what we really believe if we think about it at a deep level. But we're worried that when we go off into the business world, we're going to get pulled away from that. We're going to be pressured to do something different. We're going to be forced to make the numbers. One of the people in the study talked about when, he'd only been out of business school 4 months, and actually called me and said he was ready to quit. I said, why are you going to quit? You've only been there 4 months. He said, because my boss is asking me to move the numbers around because we got a client presentation and we want to impress them with how this company is. And he said, I refuse to do that. I said, don't quit. Hang in there. But don't go beyond your values. But he had that early values test. He stayed true, but he was worried that he was going to lose his job, and sometimes people do. Because are you going to be subjected to those pressures? Yes. Will you get pulled off course? Maybe yes, maybe no. But the question is, can you come back to your true north? Will you be seduced, like many CEOs have been seduced, by great wealth, great accoutrements, great perks, company planes and all that, to be something different than who you are? We saw so many in my generation do that. And I just strongly urge you to think about what is your true north and how can you stay on that course? Well, I think it requires development. You have to develop yourself as a leader. It's no different than if you want to be a great athlete and bike in the Tour de France or go to the Masters or a great cellist that plays at Carnegie Hall. You may have great gifts, but you have to practice every single day. And leadership is the same thing. You don't become a leader at age 40 or 50 when you get that big job. You have to start practicing right now. The sooner, the better. And here's some of the things. Here's 5 things that the leaders we talked to said they thought were really important in developing themselves. And just as a side note, in my informal study of leaders who failed, everyone who I've seen fail has failed to lead themselves. It wasn't they couldn't lead other people. They failed to lead themselves. So what does it mean to lead yourself? What are the things you have to do? I think the first is gaining a high level of self-awareness. Pete Sims came up with this survey that was done from the members of the advisory board here, the Alumni Advisory Board, Business Advisory Board, in which they said the most important thing in business leadership is self-awareness. Well, it's easy to say. The Oracle of Delphi said thousands of years ago, know thyself. Well, how do you do that? You can be introspective, but I think the best way to know yourself is through feedback. Joel Peterson said feedback, there's a professor here, said feedback is a breakfast of champions. I think it's a great phrase. You know, the hardest thing we all have to do is how do you see yourself as others see you? We all have blind spots, and we see ourselves, we want to be seen. I was just asked on the radio this morning, what about people that are narcissistic? Yeah, they look in the mirror, they look in the water and see a reflection of this beautiful person. Except that's not how other people see you. They see the real you. And one of the leaders of a mid-sized company, Doug Baker, tells the story. When he was 35, he thought he was on track to be a great leader. He'd just come back from Germany. He took over a subsidiary company that his company had just acquired in North Carolina. And he announces to everyone, we're going to go through 360 feedback. And we're bringing the Center for Creative Leadership to do that, and I'm going to be the first one to go through. So you get to evaluate me, then everyone else will evaluate you. And so he was pretty cocky, and he got his feedback back, and he said, it was like somebody flashed a mirror at me when I was at my absolute worst. It was just horrifying what I saw. They told me I was arrogant, conceited, pushing my own agenda, not interested in anyone else. So then I went off with the executives from 8 other companies, and we spent a week together, and I was a really nice guy, and I really listened to their stories and was very empathetic, and I was the last one, and they gave me feedback on how they saw me. They said exactly the same thing my people did, that all these things. And so I realized I had to reform. I had to change who I was, my leadership. And so I went back, kind of like somebody coming out of AA, and I went back and said, look, here's the feedback you gave me. Will you help me? It takes a lot of courage for a leader in a high-level position to say, will you help me? It's pretty hard to turn down when somebody says, yeah, will you give it to me straight? But there's nothing better than honest feedback. And there's nothing worse than leaders that push away people to give them honest feedback or shoot the messenger or surround themselves with sycophants who just tell them how great they are. There's a real danger the higher up you go in leadership to have that happen. But I think early in your careers, it's really important to get that kind of feedback, because then you can, that's the first step to having excellent emotional intelligence and really seeing yourself as others see you. The second is testing your values under pressure. Never listen to a leader that tells you what great values she has or he has, or even watch people's values when things are going really well. It's easy to have good values when things are going well. It's when you're tested under pressure that you find out what your values are, because that's when you're faced with sacrificing, giving up things you've done to stay true to your values. John Huntsman today started in a very modest rural family in Utah. He grew up to be head of Huntsman Chemical, now Huntsman Corporation, very successful business, multi-billion-dollar business. But when he was in his late 20s, he was in the White House of Richard Nixon. He worked for the Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman. He thought he was doing really well. One day, Haldeman calls him in his office and said, John, we got a congressman out in Southern California who's opposing the president's initiatives. Here's what I want you to do. We need to embarrass this guy to get him turned around. Take this number, call this plant manager, and I want you to put 12 illegal immigrants, illegal workers in this congressman's plant. And then we'll send federal agents in and we'll catch him and cause him some embarrassment. So Haldeman says, sometimes we act, Huntsman said, sometimes we act too quickly without thinking about what we're doing. So I called the plant manager and I started giving these instructions. He said, 15 minutes later, my inner moral compass made itself notice. And I realized this was absolutely wrong. And I said to him, forget that I ever called. I'm not going to play this game. He said, I knew instantly that was the end of my White House career because with Bob Haldeman, loyalty was everything. And I went back to Haldeman and told him I wasn't going to do that. And with it, I had to resign because, but at least I was true to my values. And years later, when he was facing bankruptcy, he was indeed true to his values and stayed true to his integrity. But it was that early life experience, I think, that he was able to project forward throughout his life. The third area of development is understanding your motivations. How do you find a balance between the extrinsic motivations, money, fame, power, glory? We all like that. We all like recognition of our peers. We like good grades. We like good salary or salary increases, like bonuses. But if that's all you like, you may wind up at 40 or 50 and find you got the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow and it's hollow. It's empty. There's nothing there. And you say, is that all there is? But by that time, it may be too late to go back and retrack what's important in life. I guess it's never too late, but it's very difficult. There's nothing wrong with those things, but you need to balance those with your intrinsic motivation. I think the time to think about that is now. Just think about, what do you want people to say about you at your funeral? What are they going to say? And what really motivates you? Are you motivated by helping other people? Are you motivated by your own personal development? Are you motivated by building a great company? Are you motivated by making a difference in the world? And as you think about that, you can get a balance in those motivations. And when you can put that together with your capabilities, you found your sweet spot. I was with Kevin Shearer. He had actually a nasty article in the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday. I was with him Monday and knew this thing was coming. He's CEO of Amgen. And they're going through a rough patch. I said, you go through good patches and bad patches. It's kind of the way business is. But Kevin, when he left GE, blew out of there and went to MCI. I think he was going to become CEO overnight. And he was very arrogant and very dictatorial. And he got handed his head. And he said it was miserable. And after 6 months, he realized he'd made a bad decision, so he called Jack Welch back and said, Jack, I'm ready to come back to GE. And Jack said, Kevin, forget you ever worked here, and slammed down the phone. He said, at that moment, I knew I was cast adrift in a lifeboat, and I had to make a go of this big operating job. He said, I spent the 2 most miserable years of my life because I not only hated my job and the people I worked with, but I also had to confront myself. But then he got the opportunity to go to Amgen, came along, great opportunity for him, and he realized how the motivation of working for a company that could actually save lives. He went in, he said, I knew nothing about biology. He got a biologist to teach him biology. He rode with salespeople. He worked in the labs. And he really learned the business. He understudied the CEO for 7 years. He was, unlike before, he was very patient. And eventually, when he was selected as CEO, he met individually with the top 150 people in the company and said, what would you like to see me do as CEO? What would you not like to see me do? What other inputs and ideas do you have? And he took this and it gave him a mandate to make this into the world's very broadly based leading biotechnology company. But you see there, he was able to balance those motivations, not give up his desire for extrinsic things, motivations, but to balance them out and to find his sweet spot. The fourth area is building a support team. We all need that team around you. You need one person in your life. It starts with one person in life with whom you can be gut level honest, that you can bear it all, so to speak. That person for me is my wife, Penny. For you, and she's always there to kind of say, hey, Bill, is that really the way you want to look to those people today? And she's always there to be my greatest supporter when things don't go well and to kind of bring me in line when things are going well, seemingly going well. But I also have a men's support group. And I've met with these guys for every Wednesday morning for the last 30 years when I'm in town. Sometimes I've been out of town. And it's so great because a number of years ago, 10, 11 years to be precise, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was scared. I was scared. I wasn't scared about the procedure or the chemotherapy. I was scared she's going to die, and I was scared of that too. I could sit down with these guys and have a really honest discussion and feel that level of support. One of the people on our study, Dave Cox, who's now living out here, CEO of Kohl's Media, he said he got fired from a job. He said, you find out very quickly when you lose your job or you lose your family who your real friends are. And you guys may think now, I've got tons of friends. Well, you find out when things go rough, you find out you have very few people you can really count on that you know will be there for you through thick or thin. And I think you need to build that support team now. These shared life histories are invaluable when you hit the rough spots. People really know you, and they can really help you, and you'll be there for them. And and so I think having a support team is extremely important. The fifth thing is leading an integrated life. The people, my students at Harvard, number one question they ask, and in fact, I spend about 2 to 3 hours a day talking with students in my office, not about the course, but about the answer to the question, can I have a successful career, a successful work and home life balance? Many of them saw their parents and their parents' generation sacrificing their families for the job. And they know in their early jobs, before they go to business school, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience, that your employer will extract every hour you'll give them. I was with a member of our extended family the other day, and he was working 120 hours a week. He knows it's not sustainable. I know. But you can't have a life. You can't sustain that. But I think it's really important to think now about what kind of life do you want to have and put boundaries around your work. Put boundaries around, think about how much time you want to devote to yourself, to your family, and to your community, to getting out engaged in your community. If you don't do that now, you're liable to get yourself in a pattern where you can't pull back because you like what comes from that super long work week, but then you burn out at 40. And now you're going to live till 95. What are you going to do for the next 55 years? And it's important to think about that now. I coached soccer for 13 years, youth soccer for my son's teams. It was one of the greatest things I ever did. People thought it was a little weird when I leave meetings at 5:30 at night. Hey, that's just the way it is, guys. This is important to me. I'm not going to leave these people at the field, so I'm going to be there. And I think it's important to put those kind of boundaries around your life. Sometimes it's hard with some of these employers. They'll extract so much, but I think you still need to do that. Well, when you do those 5 things, I think you're now prepared to go back to your life story and say, where are the passions I find that give me the ability to lead? Andrea Jung said, and that gives your purpose of leadership. And Andrea said, if people can't see that I have passion for this business, I can't be an authentic leader. I can't be an empowering leader for them. So that's what leads you to have the purpose of your leadership and align people around a common purpose and a common set of values. And when you do those things, I think then it's quite straightforward to become an empowering leader. I love the example Anne Mulcahy, who was just acknowledged by Fortune as one of America's most respected, admired companies. Anne was called the accidental CEO. She was passed over for the job for some guy from IBM that came in from the outside and virtually destroyed the place. She took over with $18 billion in debt, didn't know anything about finance. She had to get a guy in the treasurer's office to tutor her about finance so she could stare down the bankruptcy attorneys and the bankers the next day. But she had one thing going for her. She'd built 25 years building relationship people in Xerox. And she, too, met with the top 100 people. The first 2 quit, but the other 92, when she asked, and then there are 98, said, are you willing to stay with me, stay with us, to restore Xerox to a truly great company once again? And they made that commitment and stayed together, and they're now well on their way to doing that. They've averted bankruptcy, but they're well on their way. But Anne was able to do that because she was such an empowering leader. She said to the sales organization, which totally demoralized, I'll go anywhere, anytime to save a Xerox customer. And she did. She was out in the field. She didn't spend time with a security analyst. She didn't spend time, spending all her time with shareholders and bankers. She spent her time with people that created the value, the customers and the employee. And she's restored that company. You can be an empowering leader if you just engage people and be out there in the business. And I think all of these things come together to enable you to be what we call a true north leader, someone that's true to herself or himself and can follow what you really believe. And I don't know how it is for you all, but I know some people are a little fearful of failure. I say there is no greater opportunity than getting out there and leading, because leading is the most fulfilling thing you can do in your professional life. Why is that? Because you have the opportunity to come together with a group of people and take on a really great challenge, to get knocked down, figure out what you're made of, take on great barriers, overcome them, and come back from them, and create an organization that's really meaningful, to achieve goals, to go far beyond anything you thought you could do. Medtronic went far beyond anything I ever had for it because people were so great to work with in going after these goals. And that, to me, was the most fulfilling thing that I've ever found in my professional life. And you can find that fulfillment, too, of staying true to who you are and working with a group of people to do great things. Because never underestimate, as Margaret Mead said, never underestimate the power of a small group of people to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And I want to encourage all of you to be that kind of authentic leader who can change the world and make a difference. Thank you very much.